So we could have picked a number of different lessons today. Seems how we got tonight, tomorrow, and Sunday all going on, right? But I chose the ones for Sunday. But if you want to talk about anything else today, we can also look at Good Friday kind of texts as well. So I thought we can reflect on the 3 appointed lessons for this year, and the first one is from Isaiah chapter 25. It's so I'd like you to go there in your Bibles if you would as well. It's just verses 6 to 9, and it's one of those wonderful promises of the heavenly wedding banquet, or the royal banquet, depending on the context that it would be used in. So, would you join me in just reading that Old Testament lesson from Isaiah appointed for Easter Sunday? On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats, and the finest of wines. On the mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. In that day they will say, surely this is our God. We trusted in him, and he saved us. This is the Lord. We trusted in him. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. As we walk through this part of Isaiah, if you go back to just to kind of set the context for this prophecy, you've got songs of, I'm going to go back to chapter 12, okay? Can you go back to chapter 12? We already have a promise that God's people are needing deliverance. So where do those promises come up? Well, they come up in the promise of a Messiah that we often use in and around the time of Christmas. So in chapter 7, we got the promise of Emmanuel. Virgin will conceive and bear a son. In chapter 9, we have the promise, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And in chapter 11, we've got this promise of a shoot coming from the branch of Jesse. And so what you've got here is a situation where Israel is being assaulted by some other countries, and God, at the beginning of the prophet Isaiah, says, a new king is coming, and I'm going to work salvation. And then in the intervening time, if you just so chapter 12 is a song of praise, so giving thanks to what God is going to do. And then you've got a bunch of prophecies against different nations. So all of these nations have oppressed Israel in one way or another. So chapter 13 and 14 is specifically against Babylon. If in the middle of chapter 14, starting with verse 24, you got a prophecy against Assyria, which is a neighbor to Babylon. Either the Assyrians or the Babylonians were the ones who took the Israelites into captivity and kept them in captivity. So he starts with those two. And then the ones who surround Israel. So in verse 28, it's against the Philistines. In chapter 15, it's against Moab, which is to the east. And in chapter 17, against Damascus, which is to the north. Cush and Egypt to the south in 18 and 19. And then again, Cush and Egypt in chapter 20. Back to Babylon in chapter 21. And then again to the east, Edom, Arabia in chapter 21. Chapter 22, then a prophecy about Jerusalem. And it's a call to repentance. And a time when there will be restoration again. And then against Tyre, which is on the coast to the north of Israel. Prophecy against Tyre. Remember, that's the one where I said they destroyed the city. It was an island city, and they destroyed, the kind of twin city that was on the shore, threw everything in the ocean and marched across there on a bridge that was made that way. Then a more general devastation of the earth. And then we get to this interlude with a song of praise. And you can see that there's praise in chapter 25, and there's praise in chapter 26, and in chapter 27 it's about the deliverance of Israel. So, and then they go back to woes. So a more judgment. But what you've got, where this is set, is in the middle of these series of judgments that God is making against the nations around Israel. And chapters 25, 26, and 27 is a little hymn of praise that's kind of set in the middle of it. So it's really shifted, and it's this beginning of this song of praise that we hear this message. And it's a song of renewal. You can see if you're looking at chapter 25 and verse 2, it talks about the city being made a heap of rubble. The fortified town, that is a town that has walls around it that's been destroyed. And so there's judgment. And it's on this mountain then in verse 6 that God says he's going to reestablish his reign. What mountain is he talking about? Mount Zion, yeah. So it's in the city of Jerusalem. It's a place where the king reigned. And he says, on this mountain, the Lord Almighty. And what's he going to prepare? A feast, a rich feast. And it's a feast. Now, there's some debate among scholars about, is this about the heavenly banquet table, which it refers to, quotes this passage in the New Testament, or is it a royal banquet? And the reality is that in the New Testament, both images are there, even in the words of Jesus, right? So he'll talk about the king in one of his parables having a banquet and inviting people to come in. And in another place, he'll talk about the wedding banquet and people being invited to the wedding of the Son. And in both of those kinds of situations, you had some pretty significant feasts. In the royal banquet, and this is the one that Jesus talks about in Matthew a little bit later. You remember where the guys come in and they're not dressed appropriately, so they get thrown out? Well, that's because if you're in a royal banquet, you better be dressed for the king, If it's a black tie dinner, you better be wearing a black tie. You better have your tux on and your really, really, really fancy dress on, because otherwise you're out of place. And you're not showing respect. The idea is you're not showing respect for your host when you come dressed inappropriately in that kind of setting. So it could be either a wedding feast or a royal feast. Because it's on Mount Zion, I think most people, at least in terms of the original context, would say it is more tipped toward the royal feast. And what kind of food is here? Rich. And this is a place where, English translations don't always carry, I think, always the best translation. I mean, they just say the best of, but what you think is best may not be what they think is best. So to a Hebrew, what's the best cut of meat? Same thing it is for us, the fattiest one, with good marbling. I said Sunday I worked in a meat packing plant, so I got used to that. And we had a lot of AAA prime steaks that came through. We had a lot of, choice meat that came through as well, and did a lot of rounds that went out to places like Kroger and A&P and stuff like that, where their butchers would butcher them up in smaller pieces. But we sold a lot to Omaha Steaks, actually. a lot to Omaha Steaks. Truckloads of loins would go to Omaha Steaks to be then further boned by their butchers and packaged. And so it's the richest and it's the finest, and it's the best. In the original language, it talks about the marrow of the bone. And I've only had marrow once. I don't think I'd ever have it again. Jerry's shaking her head. Somebody who was footing the bill said, "Oh, let's order this and see what it's like." And so we had it. Yeah, I wouldn't put it on. I don't know. Anybody else ever had marrow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a big thing in my family. Grandpa did when my grandma would make soup. She'd scoop the marrow out, put it on a piece of bread, put a little salt on it. That was a big treat.
That was a big treat. Well, I know it's considered a delicacy.
Well,
You too?
That we didn't like it. It was just so ridiculously expensive.
It was ridiculously expensive for, you know.
How big is it? Because I'm thinking of like round steak when I was a kid. It was like.
Well, the marrow is the stuff that's in the bone.
Right, it
Yeah.
was real
But the
little.
bones are long.
It's what the dog.
Okay, so it'd be.
When they're cutting
Okay,
around
gotcha.
stick, they're cutting it, so they'll take that whole bone and take it.
Yeah.
Kids like that. They
Yeah.
bought a cow, or a half a cow or something, and Jordan and Joe do the marrow.
So
They
it's
do the
long
marrow,
and
huh?
thin?
Yeah.
It's long and thin?
Well, they take it out of the bone.
It's probably expensive because there's not a lot of.
There's not a lot of it. It was
Right.
very, very expensive. I remember as an appetizer at whatever restaurant we were at that time. But that's, the idea is it's the best of the best. I remember pastorally, I had an associate in the past who, when I was gone on a Sunday, told everybody that we're all going to be vegetarians in heaven. And I got a number of people who, when I got back, said, "Pastor Dan, is that right?" And I took them to this passage and I said, well, not if this passage is true, right? Because it's the richest of the meats. This is the fattest portions. This is AAA prime. It is absolutely the best of the best. And it doesn't say we're just going to have vegetables. So, and the same thing. It's depending on how your translation is. So it's rich food. It's aged wine. So. And as I explained Sunday, you can age meat as well, which is what my boss always did. Spoiled his kids. But anyway, the best and the richest. Okay? So it's a absolutely fantastic feast. And the feast is happening because of what's in verse 7 and 8, which is... what miracle is God going to work on this mountain?
He's destroying sin.
He's destroying sin, and he's destroying the consequences of sin or death. So when you're thinking of this passage, it says he's going to destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He'll swallow up death forever. Remember, this is parallelism, so each one of those is another image of the swallowing up or the defeat of death. And he uses images that they'd be very familiar with, because when a body was in the grave, you put a shroud on it, you know. And we know that this is exactly what they did with Jesus. And we know there's a very famous shroud that some people think is the shroud that Jesus was buried in, called the Shroud of Turin. The reality is we don't know. So he has that kind of language in here to help us understand that there's something coming. And so here's a promise of a future that they're going to get a taste of when God reclaims Israel for his people. But he points to a greater future. Remember, I said this kind of messianic mountaintop, so you look at what God is doing now, and it points to something that God is going to do later. And when that happens, in verse 8, it says specifically what's going to happen.
Wiping away all tears.
All tears. All tears. And the response is a response of praise. Now, as we think about this passage a little bit, first of all, how does Jesus destroy death? How can we say death has been destroyed by Jesus? Because don't people still die?
Well, there's death and there's eternal death.
Favorite New Testament word for death is not death, it's
Sleep.
sleep. I don't want you to be ignorant, brothers, about those who have fallen asleep, Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 4. Jesus, when he's going up to Bethany, when Mary and Martha call for him because Lazarus is sick, he says on the way, Lazarus has fallen asleep and we're going to wake him up. And the disciples say, thinking he means regular sleep, well, if he's sleeping, that's good because that's something you should get when you're sick. Sleep, your body needs rest so it can heal itself. And they say, well, that's a good thing, Jesus. And he says, no, he died. But we're going to wake him up, he says. And the little girl, Jairus' daughter, Jairus comes and says, we need your help, Jesus. Come heal my daughter. Jesus gets waylaid on the way by the woman who had the issue of blood. Gets that taken care of. They come from the house, say, don't bother, she's dead. And Jesus says, she's not dead, she's sleeping. And I don't know if I read this someplace or it popped into my brain someday, but this is a phrase I like to use. By Jesus' death and resurrection, he's transformed death into not a dead end, but a doorway. Right? It's not a dead end. It's a doorway into the house of God. And so when we say that he's destroyed death, we mean by that it doesn't have the same power to take away life that it once did. And when Jesus ever talks about eternal life, when does your eternal life start? The day you believe. Anyone who believes in me, Jesus says in John 5, has already passed over from death to life. And so for us, it's an image that's reflected in this idea that he's swallowing up death. He's destroying it. And what's the significance of the phrase swallow up? What did Jesus do on the cross for us?
He took it upon himself.
He drank in, right, the poison. He drank in the poison of sin. He took it on himself. He literally swallowed it up so that death could be destroyed. Now, how is this teaching used in the New Testament? We're going to go to a couple of different places, but let's start with Matthew. I'll take the second question there first. Let's go to Matthew. And there are other places in the New Testament we could look at, but we'll just look at these for now. In Matthew chapter 8. This is the account with centurion, begins in verse 5. But this is where Jesus makes this comment referring to a banquet. Would somebody want to start reading with verse 5? Chapter 8, Matthew, verse 5.
When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed in terrible suffering. Jesus said to him, I will go and heal him. The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished, and said to those following him, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and from the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, it will be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that very hour.
So this is the account of the centurion. And once again, what's interesting about centurions is that they're always mentioned in a positive light in the New Testament. And Jesus never says, well, if you're going to follow me, you have to leave military service, even for an unchristian government. Which I think is, when somebody says, well, what about the Amish who say, well, they won't serve in the military and all that kind of stuff. I don't know how they square that with the New Testament and the way Jesus deals with soldiers. Because he deals with them here, and in another place he says to them, don't use your position to take advantage of people. But he doesn't say, you got to leave the military service because that's not a fit place for a Christian to serve. So centurions are always looked at in a positive light. And here it's especially positive because Jesus' response to him is, I tell you the truth, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. So what's Jesus saying? Here's somebody who's not a Jew by birth. And he's got a greater faith than many of the people who are a part of God's covenant people. And this is a promise, again, of a universal salvation then. I say to you that many will come from east and west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So the promise for him is a reference back to this heavenly banquet feast that we have back here. If you go to Matthew chapter 22, in the last week of Jesus' life during Holy Week, he does a bunch of teaching. And during that time, he tells a parable of a wedding banquet. And it's in chapter 22. And here it is a king who's having a wedding for his son. So Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused. And then he sent some more servants and said, tell those who have been invited that I prepared my dinner, my oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, everything's ready, come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention, went off, one to his field, another to his business, and the rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged, and he sent his army to destroy those murderers and burn their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come, so go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. So the servants went out to the streets and gathered all the people they could find, both good and bad, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. Friend, he asked, how did you get in here without wedding clothes? And the man was speechless. And then the king said, tie him hand and foot, throw him outside in the darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are invited, but few are chosen. And the wedding garment we would understand here to be the righteousness of God. He's the one who dresses them. And if they did not have clothes, he would have provided them for them. And obviously, there would have been a number of people who came to this wedding banquet who didn't have the proper clothes, because who did he invite? Right? Anyone you can find. Both good and bad.
The riffraff.
The riffraff. And they would have been provided the appropriate clothing to wear. And most commentators would say, well, that this is a reference to the righteousness that only God can give. If you come to God and say, well, God, I want you to judge me on the basis of what I did, what I thought, what I said, you'd be in real trouble. But if God has given you the righteousness of Jesus Christ, the robes of righteousness, then you've got all you need to be in the presence of the King. So Jesus builds on this. The passage also is reflected in a couple of other places. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 15. You'll see the epistle lessons from 1 Corinthians 15, so you can stay there once you get there in your Bibles. 1 Corinthians 15. And it's especially at the end of the chapter. This is what's often referred to as Paul's resurrection chapter. So he's dealing with the whole concept of resurrection in all of these verses. And specifically, the passage from Isaiah is quoted in verse 54. And let's back up to verse 50, get a running start. Somebody want to read that paragraph for us?
I declare to you, brothers, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true: death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ.
So there's the quote, death has been swallowed up in victory, from Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. So Paul specifically applies the picture that Isaiah writes about of this heavenly banquet to what happens when we get to heaven. And the other places that this, if you want to keep your finger here, because we'll be back here, or put a pen or piece of paper or something in there. Let's go to the book of Revelation and look at those two passages as well. Revelation 19:9. And this is not a direct quote, but would be more what you would call an allusion to the Old Testament. But it fits if we back up to verse 6. Verse 6 of chapter 19. So this is a picture of heaven, the multitudes there. And verse 6, then I heard what sounded like a great multitude, like the roar of rushing waters, and like loud peals of thunder, shouting, Hallelujah! For our Lord God Almighty reigns. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him the glory. For the wedding of the Lamb has come, and the bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the saints. And then the angel said to me, Write, blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb. And he added, these are the true words of God. So this whole picture of the wedding supper. Now, you notice, first of all, that as you go back into this picture, the wedding of the Lamb has come. The bride has made herself ready. The bride would be? The church, right. Jesus is the bridegroom. We're the bride. And it says we're given bright linen, bright and clean to wear. And then it says it stands for the righteous acts of the saints. You say, well, wait a minute. You said that that our righteousness isn't good enough. So what's this all about? Well, you have to understand what a righteous act or a good work in the sight of God is what? Anything a child of God does, thinks, or speaks, here comes the most important words, in faith. In faith. In other words, it's done out of thankfulness for what God has come. Again, this is tying together all of the biblical teaching concerning good works. What comes first? The healthy tree or healthy fruit. The tree has to be healthy in order for it to bear fruit. And the righteous acts of the saints are the fruit of faith. Where you run into difficulties, can other people do good things? Can an unbeliever do good things? And the answer is yes. But they're not righteous acts because they're not done in faith as a response to God's love and grace in their lives. They can do it for all kinds of other reasons. But for something to biblically be a good work, it has to be something that's done out of the context of a relationship with the living God. So the righteous acts here are those good works that have been done by the saints in faith, and they're coming to the wedding feast of the Lamb. And the last one is chapter 21, verse 4. Verse 4, and this passage like this is often read at funerals or committals. Somebody want to start with verse 1 and just read 1 through 4?
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was...
So that's far enough. It's just the wiping every tear from their eyes, because he said he would wipe away every tear in the book of Isaiah, so it's reflected there. And I don't have this one down here, but if you want another passage that's related to this, it's in Revelation chapter 7, where John is getting a tour around heaven, and he says, these dressed in white robes, who are they and where did they come from? He's asked, and John says, Sir, you know, and he said, these are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. They're before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat, for the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So same concept reflected twice, or 3 times actually in the book of Revelation, but this concept of wiping away tears. So the question is, how does this help us? Is it appropriate to cry at funerals? Have you ever heard a Christian say, well, I never shed a tear because, my faith is strong? I've heard people say that. What's wrong with that?
You're thinking that it's your strength that's carrying you, and it isn't. If you can maintain composure, and it's a big thing, it's a gift. That's out of your own strength.
So Jesus only cries twice. That's recorded in the Bible. One's over the city of Jerusalem, and the other one is that passage, shortest verse in the English Bible, 2 words. Jesus wept. Where did he do it?
Lazarus.
At a graveside with mourners. So my response is something to someone who thinks that that's the characteristic of a Christian, never shed a tear, is to say, well, that's not the way Jesus did it. And he was the Lord, and he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He already knew that. He'd already told his disciples that, but he still cried. So there can't be anything wrong with tears. And if you don't, yes, Gail.
Well, there's a passage in the Bible that talks about that Jesus keeps our tears in a bottle. Like, he captures the tears in a bottle from crying from compassion for others and stuff. It says he will, it is in the Bible, I know that, because I've quoted it better than I'm doing now to people, because it made me realize that the tears that we shed for others out of Christian compassion are precious to the Lord.
So you're going to teach me something new, because I don't know where that passage is. So we'll have to look that one up. So this idea, though, that somehow you shouldn't cry is just not a biblical notion. It's not. And it's certainly, Jesus always teaches, remember by example, so I always look at it this way. If Jesus could cry, and especially in that context of John chapter 11, it's because he's angry. The 2 words that are used there, one of them is for an anger, and the other one is for being agitated. It was used of a ship at sea that was being tossed around by waves, and death does that to us. It agitates us, and we get angry. And so if Jesus cries, it's okay for us to cry. But the other thing we know is we're going to see this person again. And what comes back to me is something that Dorothy and Bob Nickel, Dorothy told me this. She came to me one day when, this was after Bob died, and he had cancer, and it had been a journey, a number of years. And Dorothy came to me one day and just said, Pastor, I don't know how to help my neighbor. He said she's got cancer, and she's Jewish, not conservative or Orthodox, but she's Jewish, and it's so hard for her because she doesn't believe there's anything after this life. And she said, when Bob walked through this, yeah, it was hard, but we always knew that we're going to see each other again. And as hard as it could be, and as many tears as we shared along the way, we always had that hope and that comfort and that joy that we aren't, done with life because of the resurrection of Jesus. And she said, I just don't know how to comfort her, because she said what she did is she started really pulling in. She just kind of stopped living because she was kind of grieving her own death and the belief that there's nothing else beyond. And the trouble is, there wasn't much advice I could give Dorothy about how to do that, because if that's what you really believe, yes, there is no hope. There is no hope. And how hard that would be to walk through that kind of thing. So, but it also brought home to me, and I think especially to Dorothy, what a transformative thing the gospel is, and the belief in a resurrection in terms of how you face your own death and how you face the death of a loved one in that context, because you do have that hope. And I always laugh because one of the evidences of that hope was, just remember, Ed Steinbacher, when he went into they have a crypt at Wisconsin Memorial, and he said, now normally, I forget, I think they bury him head to foot, so somebody goes in first and somebody second. He gave them instructions, and he told his wife and his kids, you better make sure it happens. When they put us in, I want them to put us in feet to feet. Because on the day of resurrection, I want to stand up and give my wife a hug. And had a good sense of humor, so it was kind of fun. Yeah, Gail.
I found where it says it's Psalm 56, 8 and 9. God collects our tears in the Bible.
Oh, okay. Well, let's take a look at that one. Like I said, that's why I like Bible study. You always learn something new.
Which verse, Jen? 8 and 9.
Okay. That must be a different translation.
Yeah, mine doesn't say that either.
Says you have collected all my tears in your bottle, you have discarded each one.
I'd have to look at the original language, but the way it's here is that they're on a scroll. And the study note indicates this would be the royal records as matters calling for your action. So I'll have to look at it. Does talk about God remembering and recording our tears, collecting our tears. But here it says, record my lament, list my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record? And the idea is that God, either image is that God knows and sees what we cry about.
Mine says bottle too.
Laura's got the bottle.
You got the bottle?
Preserve them
version
in
is
your
it?
bottle. You have recorded every one in your book.
What translation do you have?
Living Bible.
Okay, that's a little bit more of a paraphrase than a literal translation.
Well,
So-
my NIV says as an alternate. It says what you're saying, the scroll. But as an alternate, it says, or I put my tears in your
Wineskin, which would be a bottle. Their kind of bottle. So, yeah, I'd have to look at why in the Hebrew, but I don't have my Hebrew with me here, so. Either way, God collects our tears, right? Doesn't disparage them, but He collects them. Alrighty, well, let's move on to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the beginning of the great resurrection chapter that Paul writes in addressing the Corinth. So let's read that together, the verses that I have down, and then we'll kind of look at the whole chapter, because the whole chapter is about resurrection. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, This is what we preach, and this is what you believe. All right, I'm going to excuse myself for just a minute while you talk about the first question. What's one piece of advice that you needed to be constantly reminded of?
Holding firmly to the word.
Well, I thought you gotta be asked.
No.
Yes, okay. Yeah. A little bite, but she said, but she's got 3 from the triplets, yeah. I brought it some
Yeah.
to Lynn tonight for her 2 little ones.
So what'd you come up with?
Hold on to the word.
Huh?
Hold on to the word.
Hold on to the word. Put your dishes in the dishwasher.
Wipe
Or in the
counter,
sink.
Dan.
Wipe the counter. Or the stove after you're done
Or the
making your...
stove.
Yeah. The point there is just that there are often things that we regularly do, but we still have to be reminded. Now, why does Paul have to talk about the resurrection with this audience? And for this, you just need to understand a little bit about the Greek, again, mindset, which is probably where Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians comes from. What did the Greeks believe about the immortality of the body and soul?
What is that passage? The Greeks.
The Greeks believed in dualism, and dualism that separated the concern and belief about the body and the soul. So what the Greeks believed is that the soul was immortal.
It was immortal.
It was immortal. But the body was not. And very often considered the body as something to be to be set aside. The last thing you would want is to get your body back. Why? Well, who's the real you? Is it your body or your mind? One person put it this way. Sometimes when somebody has memory issues, either dementia or Alzheimer's, they'll go visit that person and they'll say, well, he or she is not himself. Well, what do you mean he's not himself? There's his body, right? But what we mean by that is the psyche, the soul, the mind, the non-material part of the person seems to be not present. And so the Greeks believed that the most important part was that non-material mind, soul, whatever you want to call it, and that was immortal. That would never, and most religions in this world believe that part is immortal. It's going to go on to live. Some believe in connection with the body, as Christians do, and some believe without. So the whole Hindu religion is built on this system of castes, and your soul makes its way through different incarnations in this life until finally it merges into the great oversoul. In other words, everything becomes kind of one. We merge into the great kind of meaning soul in the universe. You become a part of that. When you get to the top of the food chain in Hinduism. Christianity takes a very different tack. It says the body was created by God, and body and soul are one unit. They're not separate. And so the Christian belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus and the bodily resurrection of followers of Jesus flew in the face in a different way than you and I experience it in our culture, because most of our culture still believes in some kind of physical resurrection. But the Greeks didn't. And that's why both here and then in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul's got to address this rather significant difference in culture and help them understand, no, Jesus did rise from the dead, and that makes all the difference in the world. And so he says, I'm reminding you of what you've already learned. And what are the main points of the gospel here? He says, by this gospel. What are the main points?
You're saved.
Christ died. He was buried. He was raised. He died, he was buried, and he was raised. And twice Paul says, according to the Scriptures. So he's going back again. Remember, this is the only Scripture they had was the Old Testament. Who are the witnesses to the resurrection? Why is Paul's experience different? Well, who does he list here? Cephas, who is?
Peter.
Okay. So he's saying Peter, then
12.
the 12, then
500 brothers and sisters.
500, and we don't know any outside of this experience, this list. We don't know when this happened, how it happened, where it happened. It also tells us that there's at least 500 Christians. There were at least 500 followers of Jesus that saw him between his resurrection and ascension. Who's next?
James.
James, which would probably be the brother of Jesus, not the disciple, because the disciple would have been listed up here, otherwise they wouldn't have singled him out. James, who, according to tradition, became the Bishop of Jerusalem, wrote the book of James. And then the apostles. And that differentiates apostles from disciples. All the disciples are apostles, but not all apostles are disciples. There's more apostles. So in the New Testament, for instance, people like Barnabas are called an apostle, but they're not. He's not one of the 12. And then, pardon? Paul. Now, Paul says, I'm abnormally born. What does he mean by that? Got to think timeline. When did these people all see the risen Christ?
When he was with them.
Between the time of his resurrection and the time of his ascension. When did Paul see him? After the ascension. So Paul is referring to himself as being abnormally born because he saw Christ after the ascension, not before. Why would he list all these witnesses for the Corinthians?
Because if they didn't believe in the resurrection of the body, then he's shown them other people who saw it happen.
There were a lot of other witnesses, right? So he's saying, basically, if you don't believe me, go ask some of these people. Because they were all witnesses too. Now, some people ask, well, and it does say, Peter says he in his sermon in Jerusalem, he says, well, he showed himself to those who know him. Why did Jesus have to show himself to those who knew him? Well, if I walked up to you and I said, oh, I came back from the dead, but you never knew me, you'd say,
Right.
Step over here.
let me call Rogers Community or Rogers Memorial. You need some psych help. Yeah, right. I mean, The only people who would be able to testify that it really was Jesus was
Saw him die.
people who knew him intimately and saw him die and had been with him to know this is the same guy, you know. So Jesus shows himself especially to those people. And what kind of things did Jesus do with them, do you know from the Gospels? To show that he ate with them. So his digestive system, his body, was still working. What else did he do? Yeah, Gail.
Well, why did they not recognize him when they were walking and he was resurrected? I mean, I know that his body had changed.
I'm going to get to that in just a minute.
Okay.
Okay? I'm going to get to that in just a minute because we're not going to read it all, but we're just going to walk through 1 Corinthians 15, and I think the answer is partially in there. What other things did Jesus do with his disciples? Or did they do with him? Well, that night he said to them, "Peace be with you." What was working? Mary heard him say, Mary. His vocal cords were working, right? And then he said, well, he actually says in the original language, it's more like stop hanging on to me. In other words, she could touch him. And when he showed himself to the disciples, he said, you can see my hands and my feet. When he sees Thomas, he said, put your hands in the nail prints of my hands and in my side. They could see, they could touch, they could hear. So they saw him do things with that body that indicated it was fully human, revived body. Now let me just walk through, and this will answer maybe a little bit of Gail's question. Okay? So if we start with, just track with me through 1 Corinthians 15. So we've read through verse 8. We read verse 11, which we haven't answered that last question yet. But anyways, the verses 9, 10, 11 are kind of like a personal digression, just saying what I've just told you is what I've preached, and I am what I am because of the grace of God. Now he gets into the resurrection itself, and this whole thing about, was it a real resurrection? What difference does it make? And so in verse 12 he says, how can some of you say there is no resurrection from the dead? So there must have been some people in this congregation who did not believe in a bodily resurrection. And that's what he's addressing. And he says, if there is no bodily resurrection, then what happens? Well, first of all, verse 13, Christ has not been raised. Secondly, if Christ isn't raised, the logical conclusion is our preaching is useless and so is your faith. You know, when I'm teaching this to confirmation kids, I always like to say it this way. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then what I'm doing right now and what you're doing right now is just a waste of time. That's the implication of no resurrection. What we're doing right now is a waste of time. What we're going to be doing tonight, tomorrow, and Sunday is a waste of time. If Christ was not raised from the dead. Our preaching is useless and so is your faith. More than that, in verse 15, he says we're found to be false witnesses about God. Because we've been around saying Jesus rose from the dead, and if that's not true, well, now I'm a false witness. Now I'm a liar. And if he didn't raise him, then Christ has not been raised either. And if he's not been raised, then once again, your faith is futile, it's useless. And here's the additional thing in verse 17, you're still in your sins. Then that means Jesus' death meant nothing, but some human being died. Because you remember, Jesus said, when they said, give us some sign by which we can say that we should believe and trust your authority, he said to them, tear this temple down, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. That's one place. In the other place, he says, no sign is going to be given this generation except the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a big fish, so the Son of Man will be in the earth 3 days and 3 nights and rise to life again. In other words, Jesus said, whether what I'm saying is true or not, you'll be able to tell by if I come back from the dead. We believe in Jesus because of the reality of the resurrection. And then he says, then those who've fallen asleep in Christ are lost. So just what I said about, Dorothy and the hope that she had with Bob and that her neighbor didn't have, well, that's shot to heck too, right? There is no hope if Christ isn't raised from the dead. And then finally he says, we should be pitied more than all men. Why? Why should people look at us and pity us?
Because we fell for it.
Because we fell for it. And we're living our lives based on a lie. That's pretty depressing, isn't it? Right? I mean, what Paul does is he kind of just takes you on a spiral down and says, now if this, then this, then this, then this, then this, and finally, people should pity you because look at them idiots, right? There's a big but that comes next. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since the death of came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes from a man. So the challenge, he says, is that if there is no resurrection, he's saying to those who say there's no resurrection in Corinth, then there's no ground for your faith or your life or the way you're living your life, the thing you're basing your life on. But if in fact Christ has been raised from the dead, it makes all the difference in the world. And a further thing, if you jump to verse 32, if the dead are not raised, then what should we be doing? Partying here because this is all you get. And when it's done and over with. Those are the logical conclusions if someone doesn't believe in the resurrection. But if someone does believe in the resurrection, it makes all the difference in the world, because just the opposite of that is true. That then our faith is not in vain, but it's the most important thing in our lives. This relationship with the living God. Not only is our preaching not useless, but it's the most powerful thing to give people hope and confidence and faith when it comes to their own shame and guilt, the forgiveness of sins, and when it comes to a resurrection comfort that we are going to see each other again, hear those voices of the ones that we have loved, and share in the heavenly banquet that was described in Isaiah chapter 25. So, now he talks about the bodies. This kind of gets to Gail's question about, well, how come they didn't always recognize him? And this is the way that I like to say it and see it. He says, with what kind of body are they going to come? And this is his analogy. He says, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And when you sow, you don't plant the body that will be, but just a seed perhaps of wheat or anything else. And then he talks about not all flesh being the same. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, Verse 42, so will it be of the resurrection that the body is sown imperishable and it is raised imperishable, sown in dishonor, raised in glory, sown in weakness, raised in power, sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body. And then he says, so it is written, the first man became a living being, the last Adam a life-giving spirit. The spiritual didn't come first, but the natural. The first man was of the dust of the earth, the second man from heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those of the earth. And as is the man from heaven, so are those who are of heaven. And just as we've borne the likeness of the earthly man, so we shall bear the likeness of the man from heaven. So the way I understand this, anyway, is that our bodies are the same, but they're different. Okay? They're transformed in such a way. So the question, here's a whole bunch of hypotheticals. Think of all babies and children that died, how old are their bodies going to be in the resurrection? I have no clue. Will it be the same body? God says yes. And I think the seed analogy is helpful here, because if you think about a seed, you put a seed in the ground, right? And it gets, all it needs is water, warmth, and then eventually when it pops through sunlight, and a plant grows. Is there any relation between the way the plant looks and the seed? If you had never seen a corn plant before and you saw a corn seed, would you guess that that seed would produce a plant that's, 5-6 feet tall and grows these big ears? You've seen an inside of a tomato seed. Okay, when you plant a tomato seed, you get a tomato plant. Does a tomato plant look anything like a tomato seed? Does an apple tree look like an apple tree? And yet, everything that corn plant is packed into that seed. There's nothing been added, no new genetic material. It's all there, Same thing is true with the tomato. All of the tomato plant and all the tomatoes that are going to come from it are packed into that little seed. So when Paul uses this imagery, he's saying it's the same, but it's different. How different is it? Well, the Bible doesn't really tell us. What we do know is all the physical functions were there. They could hear his voice, they could touch him and hold on to him. They could see him. They could watch him eat food. They're the same, but they're different. And what's that transformed body going to be like? All I know is that our bodies are going to be like his. So some people have guessed, and this is not in the Bible, so don't say Pastor Schneider said it. Okay. Some people have suggested, well, are we going to have scars on our new bodies? Jesus did. Some people have suggested perhaps the only scars that are going to be there are scars that were garnered as a result of the faith. So people who were martyrs, maybe had their head cut off, they're going to have a scar around their neck. Doesn't say that any place in the Bible. Don't know. What we know is it's the same, but it's different. And it might be just different enough that, for instance, Mary did not recognize Jesus until she heard his voice. And as soon as he said Mary, she recognized who he was.
Didn't Jesus' body, though, after resurrection, didn't he walk through the wall? Didn't he walk
We
through
don't
the
know.
wall?
It doesn't say he walked through the wall. What it says is that he came into a room that was locked, with all the windows and the doors locked. Now, did he walk through a wall? Was he, beam me up, Scotty? I don't know the how. All I know is, and again, his body's the same, but it's different. So somehow he could get in.
Well, it makes me think about quantum physics because
Right.
this is solid, but inside it's moving.
Right.
So if you could see inside, it would be different, but it's the same material.
But it looks like it's solid, but
Yeah. So that makes some sense.
yeah. So no, it's one of those things where you say, well, we don't know because we don't know. Either we don't know because we can't understand the physics behind it. I don't understand quantum physics either, right?
We have a parallel though. You could kind of have a parallel somehow,
Yeah. But what we do know is that his body was the same, but it was different. And so that's one of the places. It also says in another place that he's transforming our lowly bodies that they might be like his glorious body by the power that enables him to subdue all things to himself. I know that one by heart because it's used at committals. As we think about the body that is and the body that will be. Now, as a result, if death has been swallowed up in victory, so what difference does it make? You can look at verse 58. He says, therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. In other words, what you're doing for Jesus is going to last. There's the righteous acts of the saints from Revelation 19, things done out of faith, out of love for God and love for neighbor, according to the will of God. I also love what he does. He goes from the ethereal to the mundane. In chapter 16, what's his first thing? Now about the collection. He goes from, this rapturous language about the resurrection in the very next verses. Now about the collection being gathered for the people in Jerusalem. So that's as much as I can give you, Gail, on that question, because it's what the Bible gives us. It's the same, but it's different. What we know from Scripture is that they could recognize his voice, they could see him, they could watch him eat, and yet he could get into a locked room. And yet they didn't always recognize him right away, any more than when the men were out fishing and Jesus says, did you guys catch anything? Put your net down. Then they come up with a big catch, and all of a sudden Peter says, it's the Lord. And he throws on his clothes and jumps into the water and swims to shore. Okay, well, I guess the last question that we're going to do today, just to kind of wrap up, is the one on the top of the backside. How does the grace of God in your life affect your view of yourself, of God, and of others? And this is drawn out of that phrase by the Apostle Paul at the end of the epistle lesson when he says, I don't deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. How does the grace of God in your life affect your view of yourself, of God, and of others? What do you think?
One of the things that's been going through my mind as we talk about this, I know we're talking about resurrection, physical resurrection at the end times, but you were dead in your trespasses and sins. So right here, the grace has changed our life in such a way that we're different. I mean, I've had people say, you're different.
Yeah.
What a wonderful thing for this life.
What a blessing it can be to us.
The grace of God in our lives.
Now, I still remember a gal in my first congregation who came to, she was a relative of one of the members, and came when we were offering an adult instruction class, and she came and I asked her, well, what got you here? And she said, well, my sister has known and lived in Jesus for a long time, and I want what she has. Because I can see what a difference it makes in her life. I want to know Jesus that way. And I think one of the challenges for us is we grow up in it, so we don't sometimes realize what we have, right? We take for granted the way that Jesus gives us hope and strength and comfort and all of those things just because they're very familiar
And sticks with us as we are going through
challenging times.
I'm just thinking about messing up our lives and stays there with us. And so, it's
We live by grace, and certainly Paul knew that, not only because he was called out of that experience, but remember, even as a Christian, he could say, as he did in Romans 7, the good I want to do, I don't find myself doing. The bad things I don't want to do, I find myself doing. Oh, wretched man, who can save me from this body of death? Thanks be to God, he gives me the victory through Jesus Christ my Lord. That even when those kind of things assail us, we recognize that we are so treasured by God, that we are loved immensely in spite of our sinfulness. And I think that's the way it transforms sometimes our view of others. Now, when I look at you, you're one of God's daughters or sons. And And God values you that way. And so, how can I not assign that same value as a child of the Heavenly Father, as somebody who starts to see with his eyes and his heart? How can I not see you as somebody of immense value, somebody for whom also Jesus died? God's grace transforms the way that we look at ourselves. And I think the way that we look at God is, all you can do is say thank you. You know? Shortest prayer, best prayer is just saying thanks for what you do for me, have done for me, are doing for me as I make my journey through life. So that's a good note to close on. Let's pray. Thank you, Jesus, for the blessing that you give to us in this Holy Week of knowing how treasured we are by your Heavenly Father, how loved we are, that you would walk the way of the cross for us, how graced we are, that your Spirit has brought us into this relationship where we trust and believe and walk with you, a relationship that gives us a sure and certain hope, made certain by the resurrection, your own resurrection from the dead. And we thank you, Lord, for the hope that gives us when we have to face the death of others, but also as we go through life, that because you're a living Lord, you walk with us each and every day. You promised to never leave us or forsake us, that you would be with us always, that you'd be the good shepherd who would walk with us through every green pasture and through every dark valley. And we thank you that because you are a living Lord, we have that assurance, that confidence, and the peace that brings to our hearts. We thank you for the grace that you poured into our lives and ask you to be gracious, help us be gracious as we deal with others around us, seeing how much you value them as well. We commit this day into your good and gracious hands for the sake of it, in the name of your loving grace for us. Amen.